Masechet Hagigah, Daf Chaf. We complete the first perek and also begin the second perek. We have three main topics today. We complete the second perek and begin the third perek. Three topics. The first is that if someone decides to be stringent upon themselves and treat regular food like it's sacrificial food, and they do this all the time, then that is actually effective and it will rise to that standard. We'll bring a proof from our Mishnah that that is the case. Second, there's a law that in order to, if you purify something, you have to keep your attention on it. If you get distracted, then you have to assume that while you were distracted, it became impure. And that's true of something being switched with another, and you weren't concentrating on the original item, or someone else is holding it. So we'll see three cases that are all impure because someone was distracted. We're going to challenge it and we're going to respond. And then we're going to see in the next perek, beginning first Mishnah, 11 ways that Kodesh food is treated more stringently than Terumah food. Okay, we begin. Amar Rav Mari. Shema mina cholin shenaasu al taharat hakodesh kekodesh damu. So we learned from our Mishnah, we'll see exactly which clause in our Mishnah, that if you take cholin, that means regular food, the kind that we eat every day now, and someone decides he wants to be very stringent and eat everything as if it was sacrificial food. As we said, we know the Dead Sea sect did something like that because they went to the mikveh before they ate anything. They had separate plates because they didn't want to touch each other. And we do a little bit, we kind of treat our food, bread, like terumah, and that's why we wash our hands. Okay, so but there were people that would be stringent. They wanted to be, like special, like they're in the Bet HaMikdash, and they probably were doing this even after the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed, because to continue that sense of holiness. All right, if they do that, then yes, it is in fact considered like Kodesh. They can't just say, oh, we were just making believe it's Kodesh. It actually acquires that status for many laws. Okay, mimai, how do we know that that is true? Because in the Mishnah, remember it had 5 different levels of food, going from cholin to maaseh sheni, terumah, Kodesh, and mechatat, paraduma. And there is no level there for someone who treats regular food like Kodesh. That's not its own level. And therefore, since it doesn't have any other special level for it, it must be that if you treat your cholin like Kodesh, then it'll go into the level of Kodesh. So that's the proof. Now we say not necessarily. So not necessarily, maybe the reason that the Mishnah did not make a separate category is because cholin that you treat like Kodesh will actually end up being in the middle, like Terumah. Or maybe it'll end up being like cholin, meaning your treatment of it like Kodesh doesn't really work, doesn't affect anything, and it's just cholin. So maybe it fits into one of the other categories that are in the list of 5, and that's why it doesn't list anything special. That doesn't necessarily mean that it in fact jumps up to being Kodesh. After all, we have a Mishnah. Cholin shenasu al tarat hakodesh harehen kecholin. Rabbi Elazar ben Sadok omer harehen keterumah. Mishnah says, and in fact, or Braita, rather, that there's 2 opinions. One says if you treat cholin like Kodesh, it will actually be like cholin. It doesn't affect anything. Rabbi Sadok says it becomes like terumah. And so, if it touches something else and so on. So we really can't tell anything from the fact that our Mishnah has 5 levels and doesn't have any special level for it. Doesn't mean anything. This type of cholin that you treat like Kodesh can end up fitting into any of the other categories just as well. Ela misefa, rather we're learning from the stories at the end of the Mishnah, where we said Yosef ben Yoezer Chasid Shebakiona Vaitamit Pachto Midras HaKodesh. Yosef ben Yoezer, he was the most pious member of the priesthood, and his clothing was considered a midras, was considered tameh midras for Kodesh. In other words, even if we don't know for sure that a Zav came and sat on this, because he's not as careful, we have to treat his clothing as if it's midras, if someone wants to have sacrificial meat. Yochanan ben Gud Geda היה אוכל עטרת הקודש כל ימיו והייתה מטפחתו מדרס לחטאת. Yochanan ben Gud was even more careful, and he would eat everything all food, even chulin food, as if it were Kodesh. He's a good example of exactly what we're talking about. And yet, his clothing was considered tameh midras if someone was eating chatat. So if someone is getting ready for a sacrificial meat and they happen to come upon Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgoda's clothing, he would have to consider it, oh, that's like a midras, and he becomes tameh. Midras becomes a high level of tum'ah. So lechatat la kodesh la, and we see from here that he is tameh as for a chatat, meaning for mechatat, midras for someone who's doing mechatat, but la kodesh la. So if lechatat only he would. Let me just repeat what we said before. I think I said the wrong level. He was so careful to have everything like it was Kodesh, that everything he had touched and watched actually was Kodesh. Now, it didn't rise to the level of mechatat. If there was a kohen who was preparing para aduma and mixing it with the waters, and he touched Yochanan ben Gudgeda's clothing, then he would be tameh and treated like tameh midras. That's the highest level, but that's very unusual. However, someone who was just eating sacrificial meat and he came and happened to touch or sit on Yochanan ben Gudgeda's clothing, he would be okay, right? La, meaning not a problem. And so you see that someone who is careful to always eat chulin out as kodesh, so it's both a chumrah that, he has to do all that. But in this case, you see, it's a kula because he treats everything like chulin. Even when he's not eating sacrificial meat, we consider everything he does to that level. And so that's a perfect proof. If you are so careful that you always treat your chulin like kodesh, then you can assume that he's really careful in doing all that, and he's not going to cut corners because it's really chulin. He's going to treat it really as if it's a sacrificial meat, and everything is tahor. Okay, so that's section number 1. Now, in order to achieve this high level of kiddusha when you're eating terumah or kodesh, you have to really be very careful to make sure that nothing touches or comes in contact or sits on all these something that's supposed to be tahor. And therefore, we're going to have 3 cases. A friend picks up a shawl that you dropped. Even though you're watching it, you have to assume it's impure. If you have Shabbat and weekday clothing and they're switched and you're watching it, but you didn't know you misidentified it, impure. If the two people are in the bathhouse and they switch the clothing, one takes the clothing of the other, even though someone is watching it, you're not watching it. And so it's impure. So we'll see these cases where distraction, we have to assume impurity, but then we'll see a case where it's not true. If you switch wheat and barley, loaves, then it's pure because you're watching it and then you just didn't know what it was. You just misidentified, picked out the wrong one. And so, and we'll see a couple of other stories that say it's okay. And so we'll have to have a response and explain each of these cases. At least for the first case, we're going to answer that a person does not watch what someone else is holding. And so even though your friend is holding on to it, since your friend is holding on to it, you're not watching it as much as if you were holding on to your own item. And then we'll see more cases that we have to harmonize. All right, so we'll see a lot of really interesting cases, even though these are not quite practical. It's a good logical exercise to try to distinguish between levels of trust. And some of this will be relevant to like hashgacha, right? Mashgiach to a restaurant. How often does he have to be there? What level of suspicion do you have to take into account? Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar, nafla me'aforto hemena, amar lechavero tenali, untana lo temea. So you have a shawl and you're being stringent regarding, you're making sure you're pure for whatever level that you are. Maybe you're going to go eat terumah, and your shawl falls off, and you tell your friend, you're right there, and you say, please do me a favor. Can you pick up that shawl for me and give it to me? You have to assume it's tameh, right? Because it was out of your hands. And even if you know that this is your friend and your friend is tahor also, and you're watching it the whole time, nevertheless, that's considered a distraction. So even the little distraction is distraction. Case number 2. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Amram, nitchalefu lo kelim shel Shabbat bekelim shel chol ulvashan nitmeu. You have clothing that you mixed up your Shabbat clothing and your weekday clothing, and you're keeping it to make sure that it's tahor, and it turns out it was the wrong one. So because you were intending to wear this, but it turns out to be the wrong one, so you have to assume it's tameh, even though you're watching this one right here. I have it in the hanger pack. I'm making sure that nothing that won't be tameh. If I thought it was weekday clothing and it turns out it was actually Shabbat clothing, then it's impure. It's not the same level of watching. Was watching that item thinking it was a different item. אמר רבי אלעזר בר סדוק, מעשה בשתי נשים חברות שנתחלפו להן כלהן בבית המרחץ. Two women went to the bathhouse, and then as they got dressed, they took the wrong clothing. Each one got dressed with the clothing of the other. This happens a lot with coats in shul, right? Someone takes the wrong coat. It looks the same, and then the other one takes the other coat. And let's say they were both tahor, nevertheless, because they weren't wearing their own items, but someone else's, so they weren't watching the same item. That's considered a distraction. He said, no good, they are impure. All right, so we have three cases here that are very stringent, and there are different types of distractions, even though actually none of them, in all three of them, there was always someone watching that item. Nevertheless, it was a different item or a different person. All that is considered a distraction. Now, Matkifla Rabbi Yoshaya says, why are you being so strict in these cases? What about a case where I put my hand into a basket that has lots of different loaves in it, and I said, I want a wheat bread, and turns out I get some barley bread instead. Are you going to tell me that it's tameh, right? Assuming I was watching the basket the whole time. And because I thought it was one thing, and I tried to get one thing, I end up getting another. Would you say that that's also tameh? Because this is very similar to the cases that we mentioned. Maybe you'll say, yeah, we have to be strict even in that case. No, we shouldn't. We have a baraita says the opposite. If someone is guarding a barrel and he thought there's wine in the barrel, then they open it, turns out it was oil, but he was watching it the whole time to make sure nobody's going to come and make it tameh. So in that case, it is tahor from making other things tameh. In other words, it's tahor to a level of that it will not make anything else tameh, even if it comes into contact with it. So you see that even though I was watching something thinking it was the wrong thing, it's still okay. And so this proves that switching barley and wheat is okay. And therefore all the other cases here should be fine. Okay, now this baraita that you brought as a proof that it's okay to switch items, that itself has a contradiction, because the ending of this baraita says, even though this barrel that I thought was wine turns out to be oil, will not make something else tameh, it itself, I have to assume, is tameh, right? So it's tameh on a low level, that it will not cause impurity, but it itself is impure. So even in this case, in fact, I thought it was the wrong item. It actually is tameh to the point that I cannot eat it. So now, amai, what would be the difference between the first case and the second case? Amar b'yirmiyah be'omer shemartiha midabar ha'metamea ve'lo midabar ha'posla. When the person has in mind that he's going to do a halfway guarding of it, I'm going to guard it from something that will cause it to be a higher level of tum'ah, so that and if it's a higher level, then it can make something else tameh. But I'm not going to guard it that much, even for a low level tum'ah, that would only make it pasul, and a low level that it would not make anything else tameh. So he wants to guard it to that extent, but not to the greater extent. That explains why it will not make anything else tameh, but it itself is tameh, because that's what he had in mind when he was guarding it. Okay, so that explains the case. Now, can you do that? Can you do a half-baked watching? Mika nitiruta lepalga. Is there halfway watching? Yes, there is. Vatanya has hoshit yado basal al ketefo. Now, yet another case. We're bringing lots of different cases, but they all have a similarity. And here he puts his hand into a basket full of figs, and the basket is on his shoulder. And happens to be a shovel also in the basket. One of those little shovels to take out the figs. Now, while you were watching it, when you were carrying it, you had in mind to be careful to watch to make sure that the basket will not become tameh. But you did not have in mind regarding the shovel. Right? You weren't thinking about the shovel in it. In that case, hasal tahor b'magrefat teme'ah. Only the basket is tahor, and the shovel you have to assume is tameh. It's very interesting, even though the shovel was in the basket the whole time. Doesn't matter. You have to have specific intent regarding everything that you are watching. Okay, hasal tahor. We question: how could this happen? How could it be that the basket is pure, titameh magrefa lasal, and the shovel is impure? Won't the impure shovel, since it's on the basket, cause impurity to the basket? Oh, and keli metameh keli. No, a keli, one vessel cannot make another vessel tameh. Vessels and people can only become tameh to a level of rishon. So if the shovel is a rishon letumah, it's not going to cause a tumah to another vessel. Vessel cannot become sheni, and therefore we can assume that most things would be a rishon tumah, and that's why only the shovel is tameh and will not cause tumah to the basket, which is another vessel. All right, yeah, but food does become a sheni, and it's full of figs, and the shovel is touching the figs. How come it's not going to make the figs tameh? Oh, Rabbi now explained, it's when I have in mind, I am going to watch the shovel, but I'm only going to watch to make sure the shovel does not become a rishon. In that, if it's a rishon, it will cause food to become tameh. But I'm not going to watch it that much that it can't become a sheni. Assume it's chulin, and so that in which case it would make it all that a low level, even that it cannot make anything else tameh. So you see here that we proved that one can, in fact, have halfway intention and saying I intend to watch it for one level, but not for another. So yes, that is a possible thing to do. All right. In any case, now that we explained this baraita and why there's a difference, but nevertheless, in the first case where I do have in mind that it was wine, turns out to be oil, it is tahor on some level. So you see that switching one thing for another is fine, because I was watching this whole thing, and because this is true, then this is true also that if I intended to get a loaf of wheat, instead barley came out, then that would be tahor. And so since you see in these cases, even though I didn't know what the item, I misidentified the item, but it doesn't matter. I was watching the item the whole time, and so that should be okay. How come in the three cases above, why should it be that? Why should you say it's impure? Because some kind of distraction, I mixed up one thing with the other. So we're left with a difficulties. Let's go to the outline, right? We have these three cases. This is exactly the case. Switching Shabbat and weekday clothes, it's the same thing as switching wheat and barley, or switching the oil and wine, right? Or switching the clothes, right? So, I mean, the case B is the most similar. All right, so we have now we're left with the question. These say impure. According to this, it should be pure. And now we're going to see even yet two more rulings that would tell us that we should go towards leniency and say it's pure. Shabbat ifnei Rabbi Ishmael amra lo Rabbi beged ze araktiv betahora. Interesting question. The woman says, I just wove this garment. She came to Rabbi Ishmael, and I just wove this garment, and it was in purity. But I didn't have in mind that it would be all impurity, woven with purity to begin with. I didn't watch it the whole time. In other words, I was just sewing it. And now, after I'm done, I'm thinking back and I say, you know what? No one else came into the room, and I didn't touch anything tameh, and there's nothing tameh in the room. And now I'm telling you, I think it was okay. Is that okay? Or because I didn't have in mind to watch it the whole time, do I have to assume it's tameh? That's her question. ומתוך בדיקות שרבי ישמעאל בודקה, אמרה לו רבי, נידה משכה אמי בחבל. So Rabbi Ishmael started investigating, asking her a lot of questions. What did you do this? And what did you do next? And what happened? And then through all those questions, she remembered that one time and Nida came and pulled the rope. She was weaving, and she needed a little help, and Nida came and touched it. And sure enough, you're right, Rabbi Ishmael, it was tameh. Amar Rabbi Ishmael, kama gedum divrei chamim sheyomrim belibo l'shomro tahor and bilbo shomro tameh. Rabbi Ishmael says, see how wise the sages are, that they say, if you had in mind to begin with that I'm going to be careful and watch it the whole time and not be distracted, then it's okay. But if you're not paying a careful attention with no distraction, then it's tameh. Because we don't remember every little thing that happens after the fact. You have to be conscientious the entire time. And see, this is a good example of just that. Another case, another story, very similar. Shuma sebi shachat. Shabbat ifnei Rabbi Ishmael amra lo Rabbi, mapazo araktiha betahora velo haya belebi leshomra. I wove this cloth, this tablecloth, in purity, but at the time that I was doing it, I was not conscientious. I was not watching it from the beginning. Just now, I'm remembering, and I can't remember any problem. And then as Rabbi Ishmael is asking a lot of questions, he was a good interrogator, and he said, "Oh, you know what? You reminded me that the cloth snapped, and I tied it with my mouth." Now, what's the problem with that? When she tied it with her mouth, some saliva might have remained on it, and so even though it will not become tameh while it's being woven, because it's not yet a complete, it's not yet big enough to be a kli, to be a vessel. And nevertheless, even if that's so, once her saliva is on it, and assuming she was nida or something, then that saliva remains. And once it becomes big enough to be a vessel, that saliva will transfer tum'ah to the item. And she didn't remember that. How could she remember that? And therefore, you see, it is tameh. And Amar Rabbi Ishmael, kama gedolim divrei chamim sheyomrim b'libo l'shomro tahor and b'libo l'shomro tameh. Rabbi Ishmael again exclaims that, you see, when you're watching it, it's a good thing that you're watching it. Okay, the point of these two stories in the Breitot, it says, is that if you're watching, if you're not watching it, then it's a problem for sure, even if you remember something. But if you're watching it the whole time, being conscientious, then it should be okay. And therefore, and this is, even though it's in the middle of being, of making it, it was not a kli before, now it is a kli, it's like changing its identity. All that doesn't matter. In both of these stories, if she was watching it from the beginning, then it would be totally fine. And so too in our cases, it should be totally fine in our three cases, because they were watching it the whole time. I was watching it, or my friend was watching it, or it was a different cloth, but why should any of that make a difference if it was being washed the whole time? All right, so now we have set up the question. Now we're ready for the answers. And we're going to answer each one in turn. Bishlam al Rabbi Elazar bar Sadok, kol achat v'achat omedet, Chaverti eshet am haaretz u'mesecha da'ata mineh. So we're starting from the third case, where two women are in the bathhouse and they by mistake take each other's robes, and each one will say, "Oh, my friend, oh look, she took my clothing." And her husband is probably amaretz, he's not careful with things, and therefore he might be tameh, and he caused her to be tameh, and therefore the robe must be tameh. And so you see that she is probably tameh to begin. It's probably her clothing is probably tameh, and I'm wearing it, so I'm not going to be careful anymore with the clothing that I'm wearing. And that's why that's considered hesech da'at. She's diverting her mind, because it's not actually her clothing, it's someone else's clothing who was probably tameh. All right, so that case is easy. Generally, people are more protective of Shabbat clothing. They're more expensive, more important. And so he would watch it more if it was a Shabbat. And he didn't think so. He thought they were just weekday garments. And so he wasn't watching them as carefully as he would if would watch it if it was Shabbat garments. And therefore, it's significant that he thought it was a different item. It's not really two items of the same kind. But the first case where I'm wearing a shawl, it falls off. I ask my friend to pick it up, but I'm there, I'm watching it. So let it be watched in the hands of his friend, right? So why can't I watch just as I'm watching it when I'm wearing it? I could also watch it when he's holding it, right? And still being watched. What's the problem? And now we give an answer. We answered the other two cases, but even in this case, we have an answer. And Adam Shamer biyad chavero. We have a presumption. A person is not going to be as careful watching what's in his own hand as what's in his friend's hand, even if he's right there. It's kind of like, a driver is always going to be more watching the road more carefully than a passenger. Even if the passenger is very attentive, and I'm trying to teach my son how to drive, so I'm being very attentive. But nevertheless, because I know that I'm not actually driving, I can distract myself a little bit. And therefore, a person who's actually holding the shawl will always be more attentive than if his friend is holding the shawl, even if he's sitting and watching it, because he knows, oh, my friend, just in case, if all of a sudden some zav comes, I'm sure my friend will do something. And so he's not as attentive, even if he's attentive. And that's the difference. That's why if I drop my shawl, my friend picks it up, I don't know what happened in between. I'm not attentive. I have to assume it's tameh. Okay, now we're going to ask a question about this very presumption. Velo v'hatanya harei shayu chamarav u'fo'alav te'onin taharot afal pi sheflig mehen yoter mimil tahoratav tehorot. Let's say I have some items that are tahor, and I'm watching them, and then I deliver them over to a donkey driver to carry to another city. Right. So the chamar, the donkey driver, and other workers, the movers, they are carrying things that I want to be tahor. Even if I'm riding along with them, even if I distance myself from them a meal or more, and nevertheless they're tahor, right? I'm not necessarily keeping pace with them. Maybe I'm going to go ahead of them. Maybe I'm going to be behind them and stop off for something and then catch up. That's okay. And so you see from here that this is a question of what we said before. Before we said, if someone else is watching your stuff, it's not considered watching. You can't trust anybody else, and you're not watching it just as well as they are. But in this case, I'm not even watching it the whole time. I can be distant from them, and they're watching it for me, and it's okay. I trust them. So why is that? According to this, you can trust someone else. Now, it is true in the second case here that if I told them, you go and I'll catch up to you later, right? If he says specifically that he's not going to be traveling with them, and once they're no longer in his sight, then he has no idea what they did. So if you tell the chamar, the donkey driver, listen, I'm not going with you, right? You're going to be alone for a while. Then you can't trust. You knows what he did. But as long as he thinks that you're nearby and you can come and catch up at any moment, he's always going to be looking over his shoulder and making sure. So then he will watch your items. All right, our case is more similar to the first. Okay, but let's analyze these two cases now. What's the difference between the first and the second? The first case, okay, the difference between the cases is kind of obvious, right? One is you might be there any second. The second case, you're saying I'm not going to be around. We're going to get to that in the end. But in the meantime, the Gemara is going to introduce a couple of other presumptions about this case. And this one says that the Resha is when I took the donkey driver and the movers and I go and I make them tahor. Right before you could work for me, I'm carrying important stuff. I'm carrying some terumah here. It has to be tahor. So therefore, you guys, all you workers, you have to go and dip in the mikveh first before you can work for me. And so they all dip in the mikveh, and they dip their lunch boxes and everything. And so in that case, that's why I can trust it, because I purified all of them. So what am I worried about? What are they going to do? They're going to touch something that the donkey is carrying, some of the food there. It's okay, even if they touch it, they're tahor. That's why it's okay. Now, hold on. If I purified everything, then why am I worried in the second case that I'm not there with them? So let them go on their own, right? What's the worst that can happen? Well, here's the worst that can happen. And Ha'ma'aretz is not going to be particular about the contact of his colleagues. So in other words, this caravan is carrying the stuff from me, even though they are tahor and won't worry about it, but they might on the way meet an Ha'ma'aretz who's not so careful, and that Ha'ma'aretz might touch something that the donkey is carrying, and so that's no good. All right, well, if you're worried about an Ha'ma'aretz, you're not worried about that. Maybe while I'm lagging behind, some Ha'ma'aretz will meet them and touch something. The final answer is that I can always show up in a different way. They're a big caravan, so they have to go on the main road with donkeys, but I'm going on a horse, and so I might come in a different way, a circuitous path. I'm coming a diagonal, and I can show up at any time. And therefore, since I can show up at any time, the donkey drivers will be careful if an Ha'ma'aretz is around to make sure that the Ha'ma'aretz does not make any contact. But in the sefa, he will. Hold on, since he can come at any time, and sefa also he can come anytime. No, since I told them, you go ahead, I'll meet up with you later. So then they know that they are going to be distracted because he's not, our boss isn't watching. He's gonna meet up with us in an hour. So because our boss is not watching, the donkey driver will have hesech hadat. They rely on the fact that the boss is not watching, and they may allow an Ha'ma'aretz. Okay. So therefore, the point is that in order to in that case of the donkey drivers, you have two things. Number one, he purified the watchman, right? And he's also at least potentially watching them the whole time. So that's why you can assume that it's pure, even though he's not even with them, and they're going ahead. But he didn't tell them he's going ahead, so they're always looking out for him, and they themselves are pure. That's the only case in which I can trust someone else. But in a regular case up here, if my friend picks up my shawl, I didn't make him tahor, and I'm not watching him as much as if I were holding it. And so that is the difference between these two cases. So each one of these is a very subtle difference in which ones are pure and which ones are impure. But that's what they have in common. This is like an elal. They ask you, who packed your bags? Where were the bags from the time that they were here? Do you trust the driver? Do you trust the guy that put it into the trunk? Maybe he switched the bag and put something in while you weren't watching. Okay, these are all good questions that, depending on the level of security that you want, you have to wonder about even that 1 second that maybe you were online distracted. Someone could have put something in your bag. So this is the ancient equivalent of that. And with that, Hadran Alach and Dorshin, we complete the second perek. And now we begin the third perek, which are, as just the Mishnah, today is 11 differences in 11 ways in which sacrificial meat is treated more stringently than Terumah meat that goes to a Kohen, Terumah, anything, produce that goes to a Kohen, and that the Kohen has to eat betahara, and one is not allowed to make it tameh. Okay, so let's see what they are. Number one, chomer b'kodesh me'beterumah shematbilin kelim betoch kelim laterumah aval lo lakodesh. Let's say I want to take some vessels to the mikveh. We do this nowadays. Let's say I have a whole a set of utensils to put them in the mikveh. You don't have to put them one by one. That's such a pain. You drop them. It's no good. You put them all in a basket, right? And you immerse the basket. You shake it around, and that's all. That's what we do today when we have a lot of forks and knives. That is fine for Terumah as well, but not for Kodesh. If you have items that, all your silverware, you're going to make it tahor to eat sacrificial meat, you can't do them all at once. You got to do one by one, and one kli inside another kli, or let's say bowls, a smaller bowl inside a bigger bowl. You cannot do that for Kodesh. Each one separately. Second, achoraim v'toch ubet asevita. If you have some vessel that has multiple parts, it has an outside and an inside, and a part that holds it, that grips it, all these, they come together. Should they be treated as one or as separate vessels? So, like for example, let's say you have a serving dish and it goes into a metal holder, a silver holder. or like a crock pot that goes out and you can put it in and use it separately. So for Terumah, we treat each part separately so that, let's say someone tameh touches one of them, that part is tameh and not the whole rest of them. So that's a leniency that we can treat each one separately. But for Kodesh, we have to be more stringent. And if even someone touches just the inside of the crock pot, the whole thing becomes tameh. So that's number 2. Someone who's carrying in one hand something that's tameh midrash, a high level of tum'ah, like tum'ah rishon letum'ah. He can also carry terumah in the other hand, as long as he makes sure that they're not going to touch each other and not cause tum'ah one to the other. He can hold them separately. But you can't do that with Kodesh. If you're holding sacrificial meat with one hand, you cannot be holding other tum'ah in the other hand. That's 3. 4. Weekday ochle terumah mizras lakodesh. This one we saw already, that the clothing of someone who eats terumah, someone who purifies himself to the level that is eating terumah, so he's pretty good, he's tahor, his clothing, nevertheless, if someone's eating sacrificial meat and he sees that clothing and say, oh, that must be tameh midras, because the person eating terumah is not as careful as the person eating Kodesh. And so who knows, maybe he wasn't careful to watch that zav didn't come and sit on that piece of clothing. Next, 5. Lo midata Kodesh midata terumah. Strangely, the Mishnah has another introduction. Even though we had one up here, here's another statement of introduction, that the level of sacrificial meat is not like the level of terumah. Okay, why is this here? Rishonim try to figure out. Maybe it's just a second list. Maybe there were 2 lists and now they're being put together back to back in the Mishnah. That's why it's 2 headings. Shebakodesh matir umenagev umatbil ve'achar kach kosher ubatruma kosher ve'achar kach matbil. Regarding Kodesh, you have to undo. Let's say you have, I don't know, like socks, 2 socks. Sometimes people tie their socks together, right? So they don't lose them. And so you want to put them in the mikveh. If these socks are what you're going to wear for Kodesh while eating sacrificial meat, you have to undo them. You have to untie them. Even if it's just a loose tie that the water could get there, no good. You have to untie them and you have to dry them. Now, if they're just wet with water, then that water will become part of the mikveh. But let's say they're wet with oil, and oil will be a chatzitza between the sock and the water of the mikveh. So you gotta dry it out, clean it, and then you can put it in the tevilah, and then you can retie it afterwards if you want. But if retie, let's say, something that's usually tied, some kind of shawl or something that's usually tied. Whereas terumah, you can leave it tied in that loose way and put it in bitovel, and you don't have to be as careful about it. Next, kelim hanigmarim betahora sirichin tevilah lakodesh avalo la terumah. An item that you are manufacturing. Before you're finished manufacturing it, it's not a vessel yet. Anything that's not a vessel, like if you're making pottery and you didn't finish it, you didn't put it in the oven yet, so then there's nothing. Even if a tameh person touches it, it won't become tameh. So something that was finished, and at the last moment when you finished it, you were sure it was tahor. So then, if it's Kodesh, even though you finished it and it was tahor when you finished it, there's no way it could have been tameh before. Nevertheless, you have to be tovel. But for terumah, you can presume, since during the manufacturing it can't become tameh, and when I completed the manufacturing, I made sure everything was tahor, so you don't have to put it in the mikveh again. You don't have to put it in the mikveh at all. You can assume it's new, and so it's tahor. If you have, let's say, 2 apples in a basket, in a bowl, and they're not touching each other, and one is tameh and one is tahor, well, they're not touching each other. Nevertheless, because they happen to be in the same bowl, the bowl will join them together, and if one is tameh, the other will be tameh also if it's Kodesh. But if it's terumah, then it's okay. They're not touching. After all, they're not touching each other, so we don't apply that stringency for terumah. For sacrificial meat, the lowest level that it can become tameh is a 4th degree. So 4th degree, we call it, say, pasul, which means it itself is tameh. If a 4th degree touches other meat, even sacrificial meat, it doesn't cause tumah, because that's it. 4th degree is the bottom. Whereas for terumah, only 3rd degree is the bottom. So it's more lenient, because if a 3rd degree touches other terumah, it will not. That's the last. That's the last. It will not cause something else to be tameh. ובתרומה, אם נטמאת אחת מידיו, חברתה הטהורה, בקודש מטמאים שתיהן, שהיד מטמאה את חברתה, בקודש, אבל לא בתרומה. If only one hand becomes tameh, right? One hand touched a dead mouse, and so that one hand, no, that would be doraita. That would have to be a drabanan item that would only cause hand tumah. So if one hand touches something that would cause hand tumah, then only that hand has to be washed. You take your cup and just wash it on that hand, or put that one hand in the mikveh, and the other one's fine, which makes sense. But for Kodesh, you have to wash both of them. You have to put both of them in a mikveh, because we worry that, hands often touch each other, and then the tumah will transfer from one hand to another. If you're eating dry food, then you can eat that food with unwashed hands if it's terumah, because tumah only transfers if something is wet, had become wet, then it becomes susceptible to tumah. But if it did not become wet, and with water or 7 liquids and the way that you wanted it to become wet, then it does not transfer tumah. So therefore, if it's dry, you can eat it with unwashed hands. Avalo b'kodesh, that's not true with kodesh, sacrificial meat. You have to wash even if it's dry. האונן והמחוסר כיפורים צריכים טבילה לקודש, אבל לא לתרומה. Onen, someone who lost a loved one on that day, on the day of before burial, they're called onen. Now, if he's involved in the burial and carrying the body or touching the body, then he'll be tameh. We're not talking about that. We're talking about onen who lost a loved one, but he himself was not involved, didn't go to the cemetery, didn't touch the body. So therefore, the onen himself is actually tahor. Or a mechusar kippurim. This is someone who was, let's say, a zav, and he waited the 7 days, and he went to the mikveh, and nighttime came, so he's tahor, except that he didn't bring his sacrifices. Mechusar kippurim, he has to bring kapara. Okay, both of these people are fully tahor, almost fully tahor. So sirichin tevilah lakodesh, aval lo leterumah. So actually, they never, onen never became tameh. And so he can eat terumah. It's no problem while he's onen, or after he's onen. While he's onen, he can't. But after he's onen, he doesn't have to go to mikveh. He doesn't have to do anything. And so to mechusar kippurim. But for kodesh, in that case, we are more stringent, and we're going to say the onen, even though you didn't touch the body, go to the mikveh. And mechusar kippurim, you have to bring your sacrifices. After your sacrifices, only then you can eat kodesh. So we see that the rules for terumah are all very logical. They make sense. There's no tumah here. But for kodesh, we go above and beyond the regular rules, because eating sacrificial meat is a whole nother level of holiness. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.